Okay, with this image, um, I'm going to demonstrate a couple things. First of all, routines of basic routines with exposure adjustment and color balance adjustment, and specifically routines that relate to the adjustment layers and the layer masks that accompany the adjustment layers. What I have here is a problem, in a sense of limited latitude here. And what I'd like to do is interpret this image so instead of having a decent exposure here, but underexposed here, I could have, of course, in camera, have shot and exposed correctly for the shadows, but then this area would have been overexposed. So generally, it's a good idea to consider your shadow areas and to make sure in with digital photography in camera that you're shooting for the highlights. In other words, that you have captured the detail and the highlights. You can more effectively bring out the shadow areas in Photoshop than you can darken the highlight areas. It's what happens is that you lose detail in the shadow and excuse me in the highlight areas much more quickly than you do in the shadow areas. So even though this is underexposed, I can raise the levels here and raise the exposure to and reveal what there is in terms of detail in those shadow areas. If I'd exposed for the shadows and let the highlights go, this area would be overexposed and I could not bring it down. I would have lost detail that would be lost forever. I would not be able to pull it back in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do here is duplicate the layer and just routinely doing this. I just routinely duplicate layers. When I start working with an image, I make an initial working layer. And we're actually not, with this exercise, going to, you'll see, not really going to use this, but I like to routinely duplicate the layer. You might use this layer for retouching, spotting, doing some uh, corrections of the pixels in the image. You never want to do that on the original background layer. Always work in a non-destructive way in which you're working on duplicate layer. And of course, we're also going to work on multiple layers as we work with adjustment layers. So we're going to go down to adjustment layers on your layers palette and pull out levels. Levels also is a very good place to start when you're looking at just routinely looking at images and starting to work with them, because you have a histogram. You have a range of pure black to pure white as absolutes on either end and a middle gray in the middle. This range of zones of tonal values is something that is extremely important when you're shooting and when you're working in Photoshop. You in both, you'll note that we're not looking at colors, we're looking at ranges of black and white tonal values. That's how our exposure meter in the camera reads the scene. That's how we read the histogram once we get it into Photoshop. So we're looking at pure blacks, which are represented here. Um, the pure white, is really not represented. In this case, it's not going to make that much difference effectively. A little bit if we move over and actually match or align a pure white with actual pixels. In other words, these are absolute or ideal pixels, absolute pixels, absolute white, absolute black, absolute middle gray. The histogram itself, these are the actual pixels that are in the image. So just as on principle, I'm going to bring this over and have pure white represented, because I always want pure white and pure black to be represented in an image, unless I'm doing something in terms of special effect. But if I'm doing a straight exposure, I always want pure white and pure black to be represented. Then my middle value, my middle gray, which is middle gray is when you're using your exposure meter in your camera, it's averaging the scene to middle gray. In other words, it's taking highlights, taking shadows, taking the extremes, which in this case we see the extremes of highlight to shadow, taking the extremes and averaging to middle gray and giving you a recommended exposure for that average middle gray. You can see that that's helpful if, but it's not the end. You actually have to use that information that you get from your exposure meter and make some choices. And so what I did here was to make some choices. In shooting this, I decided that I could have gone in one of two ways. I could have exposed for the shadow area here, but then the highlights would be blown out and I would lose all detail. I could have, what I did do is expose for this area and let the shadow areas go dark and plan to adjust for that in Photoshop. When you're shooting digitally, and this is different for film, and it's different for slide film versus negative film, you always want to know with what materials, what medium you're working with. With digital, you want to shoot for the highlights. You want to make sure that you get detail in the highlights. You want to make sure you don't overexpose the highlights, because what happens is you lose detail more readily in the highlights than you do in the shadow areas with digital photography. So you want that, so that's why I shot for the highlight here and make sure I get the detail, the important detail in here, and knowing that in the shadow areas there is detail there. I just need to bring it out in Photoshop. So what I'm doing is working with a compromise. Basically, you don't have full latitude with digital photography or film photography, and getting simultaneously the shadow values on one end and the highlights on the other. Often there is a limited latitude that you're able to garner there. So you could make that adjustment in Photoshop. And that's what I'm going to do.